As the sun sank over the edge of the world, the shadows cast by the innumerable black towers of the fortified city flowed and merged together, oozing through the silent, empty streets like some insidious evil, invading every corner and doorway, leaving nothing untouched by the chill darkness. The Hag Queen gazed out over the rooftops and turrets of the dark elf city of Grond, watching the last feeble rays of daylight recede from the bleak, rocky wilderness of Naggaroth, the aptly named Land of Chill. Seated next to the highest window in the tallest tower of the Temple of Cain, Helberon, Hag Queen of the Witch Elves, could see right across Grond. From this vantage point, she constantly scoured the streets and courtyards with her cruel gaze, like some ancient bird of prey, surveying its territory for the slightest movement that might betray the presence of its prey. And ancient she was, as were all the Hag Queens of Cain, the Lord of Murder. How ancient even the Hag Queens themselves found it hard to remember now. Suffice to say that when Naggaroth was still a new land of promise to the exiled Dark Elves, many centuries ago, they were already the oldest of their kin. Her age did not make the journey from the Witch King's court at Naggarond to the North Tower any easier. In fact, each year it seemed to get harder for her to travel the distance across the wastes between the two cities. Every jolt of the carriage ride echoed in her aching joints and bones. But on one point she was resolved. She would not remain in the Witch King's court at this time, not while she was in this condition, even though she was the leader of the Witch Elves. She would not give her enemies at the court, especially the ageless Morathi and her panderers, the pleasure of whispering about her behind her back. Helberon knew that they would, and she would rather suffer 1,000 pain-racked journeys to Grond than tolerate such treatment. As the last ray of sunlight shone through the window directly into her eyes, the Hag Queen flinched and turned away, catching sight of her reflection in the mirror that hung against the bare stone wall of her chamber in its macabre iron frame. The creature that glowered back at her in the glass was appalling to look upon. The gaunt and drawn face, with its eyes sunk deep into their shadowy sockets, was lined and pockmarked, while the wrinkled skin hung in great folds from the neck. Tufts of hair sprouted from ugly warts on the hooked, almost beak-like nose and jutting chin. Long strands of coarse grey hair grew from the scalp. On this haggard old crone, the characteristic delicately pointed ears that a dark elf shared with their hated high elven kin had a more sinister, bat-like quality, adding to the hideous appearance of the apparition in the mirror. It was a vision of nightmares, of pious men would have been hard-pressed to create. The Hag Queen looked back at her reflection despisingly through half-closed eyes. Then slowly a cruel smile formed on her thin lips. It had been a long year. In fact, each year seemed to drag on longer than the last. But the time of waiting was over. Death Night was here once more. The guards posted at the gates of the city shivered, not so much from the cold, but because of the unnatural stillness that pervaded every street and square of Grond. Each offered up a swift prayer that tonight it would not be their bodies that were offered up as living sacrifices to the bloodthirsty chaos gods. The guards gave the barren wilderness and bleak skies only cursory glances, For on this night the greater danger came not from without, but from within. Tonight the Witch Elves would prowl through all the cities of Naggaroth, and steal away any dark elves they might find, even going so far as to break into houses to take petrified inhabitants back to their blood-soaked temples, never to be seen again. Tonight, the brides of Cain would emerge in their riotous celebrations, debauched revelries and deprived acts, in praise and honour of their master, the Lord of Murder. Tonight was Death Night. Within the temple of Cain, the Witch Elves knelt before their queen. "Sisters," the ancient crone intoned hoarsely, her voice weak and cracked, "the time has come once more that we must give praise and thanks to our master Cain, mighty Lord of Murder. His name be praised." "His name be praised," echoed the assembled sisterhood. "Let us worship him with offerings of blood and flesh, that his dark appetites may be sated." Slowly, Helberon shuffled over to the stone altar that stood in the centre of the chamber. As she did so, the other witch elves formed a circle around it. Dark stains covered the altar's cracked surface, betraying its dire purpose. On the altar rested a chalice that might once have been gleaming silver, but was now stained and encrusted with the dry remnants of the same liquid that on occasion drenched the sacrificial altar. The Hag Queen lifted the chalice in her bony grasp and raised it above her head, her frail, emancipated arms shaking slightly under its weight. "Now let us drink from the crimson cup, so that our Lord's desires may be our desires, his appetites our appetites, his thirst our thirst. Let us glory in the destruction we create in his name. Praise be to Cain. Praise be to Cain." Lowering the chalice again, Helberon put it to her lips and took a mouthful of the warm blood it contained. As she did so, her eyes cracked in dark ecstasy, and a wicked smile formed on her lips. At last she swallowed and was almost unable to contain the surge of pleasure that flowed through her wasted body at its sickly sweet taste. Turning from the altar, the Hag Queen carried the blood-filled chalice to the witch elf at the head of the circle, who then also drank of its foul contents, before passing it to the dark elf woman on her left, and so it continued, with each of the witches drinking of the life-giving fluid. When the Hag Queen opened her eyes, a hideous apparition floated before her. The constantly shifting skeletal form seemed to stretch and contract in front of her as it reached for her with talons as long as knives. The poisonous herbs mixed with the blood were rapidly taking effect, creating nightmarish hallucinations inside the witch elves' minds. And of course, the older the mind, the more vileness it had witnessed, the worse the imagined spectres. The calcified horror opened its mouth so wide that its jaw seemed to dislocate, revealing row upon row of pointed fangs dripping with blood. Helberon screamed. The piercing cry echoed around the chamber with seemingly no likelihood of its stopping. Then a second shrill cry joined it, then another and another, until the voices of the witch elves were all united in one cacophonous scream. A gibbous moon hung in the light, cloudless night sky, its wan light Only the topmost pinnacles of Grond. Not a sound could be heard anywhere across the city as the dark elf inhabitants cowered in their homes, willing dawn to come quickly. Then a shrill, piercing scream cut through the silence. The guards on the gates gripped the pommels of their swords for reassurance or hefted deadly repeater crossbows into position. Dark elves in their houses ensured that all doors and windows were firmly locked and bolted, although they knew deep down that their precautions would do little to stop the rampaging witch elves should they decide to raid their home. With a deep, resounding boom, the doors of the Temple of Cain, covered with the flayed skin of prisoners who had been flogged to death, burst open, and the savage warrior women poured into Grond streets. Whooping and howling, they ran through the streets of the city in a frenzy, their only intention to kill in honour of their depraved master. Their cries that had begun as screams of terror at the illusions thrown up by their fevered brains were now exclamations of excitement and exhilaration, as the intoxicating herbs drove them into a delirium of bloodlust. Within their homes, the dark elves shivered. Death Night had begun. Deep within the Temple of Cain, Helbron delighted in the anguished screams of the dying in excruciating pain as the witch elves put to death their prisoners. Inflicted on the sacrificial victims, the chosen ones, such tortures that every fibre of their beings was filled with exquisite agony, until at last, having suffered unimaginable torments, they were released into blessed oblivion. A young witch elf, only recently admitted to the sisterhood, approached her queen cautiously, and with her head bowed in reverence. Appropriately enough for the oldest hag queen of the witch elves, Helbron was considered one of the most dangerous and violent of all the hag queens, and all feared angering the dark witch. After a moment's pause, the young initiate spoke in a low voice. "Your bath is ready, Majesty." With the young witch elf's help, the ancient hag rose from her throne, ever so slowly hobbled across the flagstone floor and through an archway out of the room. Eventually she reached the bathing chamber. There, in sweltering humidity, another young dark elf woman was pouring a deep crimson liquid from a pitcher into the great iron cauldron that dominated the room. The bath was now full, the steam rising from it, condensing in clouds around them. With the aids of her servants, the disgusting crone disrobed, revealing the true grotesqueness of her withered form in all its macabre glory, and clambered into the cauldron, submerging totally for a few brief seconds, so that every part of her was immersed in the rejuvenating fluid before settling with only her head above the surface. Lying in her annual ritual bath, Helbron savoured the sweet smell of fear that still hung about the blood, as not so very long ago it had clung to the lacerated bodies of the dying. She luxuriated in its invigorating warmth, which soothed every aching joint and relaxed every tense muscle. There she lay, only at last having to get out before the cooling blood coagulated. The creature that rose from the bath, stepping out of the red mist gracefully and without assistance, was very different from the crone who had entered it. The young witch elf, having never witnessed the transformation of a hag queen before, stood in speechless awe, staring at the exquisitely beautiful woman now in front of her. The Hag Queen's skin, usually parried like that of all dark elves, was now like fine marble, glowing in a cold inner light. Her hair fell in long dark trestles, and her figure was the most enchanting and voluptuous the young witch had ever seen. The strangely cadaverous beauty was almost disturbing, but at the same time was more powerful and captivating than any magic, even stronger than that of Naggaroth's greatest masters of dark sorcery. "My robe, please, sister," purred the Hag Queen in a voice no longer a gasping wheeze, but now as soft as velvet, her seductive, dulcet tones stirring the girl from her reverie. "Yes, your Majesty." As she dried herself, Helberon revelled in her newly recovered strength, every part of her body feeling charged with new life, restored and revitalized once more by blood. The ancient dark elf considered that she would never lose the sensation of tingling excitement that she felt each time she bathed in the crimson life-giving fluid. Cain be praised! How many such bathings she had enjoyed she no longer knew, but that did not matter now. At that moment, the Hag Queen of the Witch Elves felt she could do anything. But there, at the back of her mind, on the edge of consciousness, was the awareness of the nagging certainty that gradually and inescapably over the coming year her body would deteriorate, no doubt more rapidly than before, reverting to its true decrepit form, until that night, which brought with it the hope of expectation of renewed life, came again. That night, when she would know the vigour and beauty of youth once more. Death Night. Urian Poisonblade. Urian Poisonblade was one of the most infamous of all dark elf warriors. He was the Witch King's personal champion, a mighty fighter of awesome ability, skill, and cunning. It was rumoured that he had been bred for battle by the Witch King himself, to be the destroyer and relentless slayer of his enemies. Urian's cruelty was as legendary as his skill. His foes said that he had the heart of a demon, and that if you were captured by him, it was better to swallow your own tongue and choke to death than survive and face the horrors the following hours and days would bring. When Urian learnt of this, he made sure that in future his prisoners had no tongue to choke on. In battle, he was all but unstoppable. He had been taught by the greatest masters of the fighting arts in Naggaroth. He let his teachers know that he would slay them once he had learnt all that he could from them, unless they could kill him first. This he did, slaying each of his teachers in turn as he outgrew them in skill and ability. The techniques he learnt made him the most deadly of fighters. It was said he knew more than 10,000 ways to kill an opponent, and 10,000 more ways to cripple them and leave them at his mercy. He could kill a bull with one blow of his bare hands, and deflect an arrow in flight with a sweep of his blade. He was death incarnate. With such ability went pride and vanity. Urian was even heard to boast that he could slay Cain himself in single combat. It may be that the bloody-handed god heard this and decided to pay Urian back, in which case his hubris cost him dear. For it was Urian's fate to meet the only warrior who was greater than himself. It was at the Battle of Finnevi plain that Urian met his nemesis. The Witch King's forces were poised, expectant of final victory, over their hated high elf enemies. Urian, as proud and arrogant as ever, strode forward and called out a challenge to single combat. Was there anyone in the high elf army who dared fight him? First, Aralian of Ivres, and then the Corvian Ironglaive, captain of the White Lions, accepted the challenge. Urian cut them down as if they were children. Then Tyrion stepped forth. The struggle between these two masters of the warrior's craft, so unlike in skill and yet so deeply different in character, was awesome to behold. For fully an hour the two mighty heroes fought in grim silence, first one gaining an advantage and then the other, but neither able to land the final telling blow before their opponent evened the odds. Then Tyrion slipped and fell heavily to the ground. Urian leapt forward, his blade held high, but before he could land his death blow, Tyrion struck. A quick thrust of his blade found Urian's heart, and the fight was over. Its end so sudden and abrupt that watchers could hardly believe that it was finished. Urian slid slowly to the ground. Their simplest of tricks, he gasped to Tyrion as he fell. You killed me with the simplest of tricks. And with that he died, receiving no answer from Tyrion other than a cold, pitiless stare. Witch Elves. The Witch Elves are called the brides of Cain, the mighty god of murder. As maiden elves, his servants were wedded to him in midnight rites of blood sacrifice and cruel abasement. When the temple fires grew hot and the night is black and cold, Cain takes new brides, and blood flows in torrents down the steps of his altar. Only the strongest and most graceful are chosen to honour Cain in this way. Their cadaverous beauty is legendary, even amongst the fair elves of Uthuan. Their unblemished skin is pale as milk, and their hair is white like ice. Their disdainful eyes are pale, and their full red mouths are quick to laugh at another's pain. When their master calls the dark elves to battle, the witch elves sharpen their blades. To the brides of Cain, the battlefield is but another temple, and combat is another chance to taste the blood of sacrifice. Mad-eyed, they fall upon the enemy, howling with lust. They eagerly sate their thirst for slaughter. They laugh as bones break and flesh is torn, and their own pale bodies are smeared with the red blood of battle. When the fighting is done, the hag queens lead the witch elves to the temples of Cain, where they bathe in cauldrons of warm blood and dance naked long into the night. The witch elves howl with pleasure to see beating hearts torn from living breasts by the knives of the cackling hag queens. These are the oldest of the witch elves, and their ancient crone-like bodies are vile and bent. Their laughter is a cackle of madness and withered lust. As they bathe in the sacrificial blood, their shriveled bodies are renewed once more, and they emerge reinvigorated with the power of beauty of youth. There is a night put aside for the brides of Cain, called Death Night, where the hag queens lead the witch elves through the streets, breaking into houses and stealing away the people from within. On Death Night, all doors and windows are barred, and elves hide in terror from the servants of the god of murder. For on this night the god shows no mercy, not even to his most faithful worshippers. Hundreds of dark elves are dragged to the altars and sacrificed, young and old, and their blood fills the cauldrons for the hag queens to bathe in. Amidst great revelry, the witch kings feast upon raw flesh and drink blood mixed with wine. After many hours, intoxicated and exhausted by the dance, they fall into stupefied sleep and do not awake for many days. Fear was not a common emotion amongst the inhabitants of Grond. Dark elves were more familiar with inflicting pain than experiencing suffering themselves. One night was different, though. On Death Night they were all rendered equal by the knowledge that death could strike any one of them at any time. An equality of dread unified the city in a way that no other event could. The inevitability of Death Night hung over the life of Grond like a blot, a pall of blood and cruelty that stained the souls of elves that lived there. Even the architecture of the city reflected this time of darkness. Doors were thick and barred with bands of iron. Windows were so tiny and narrow that no intruder could ever climb through them. For 10 long sleepless hours, dark elves would cower in their homes, listening to the screams as the witch elves dragged their captives away. The following morning, those who had survived the lottery of death would celebrate their escape in the time-honoured fashion. Each family would sacrifice one of their own household, usually a slave or an elderly relative, as thanks to the Lord of Murder for sparing the lives of them and their children. The last rays of the setting sun reflected readily off the shapely helms and finely crafted weapons of the Silverhelm patrol, the white tunics of high elf warriors appearing orange in the light. The elves were returning from the pass to the enclave of Arnhelm. Alien hated these mountains. The black spires were a relentless range of jagged peaks, precipitous crags, and bleak rocky encampments. Perfect ambush country. Alien knew that the patrol would not reach Arnhelm before nightfall, and travelling through these harsh lands in darkness appealed to him even less than having to make camp here for the night. However, he was determined that they should make it through the Stormfire Pass before they stopped. Behind Alien rode a troop of 20 high elf warriors, all mounted on the grey or dappled steeds prized by their race. Their lord's thoughts and fears were the same as those of their lord. None felt any love for the chill peaks, and all dearly wished to be back in the enclave at the soonest opportunity. Although the most capable of fighters, these lands had unknown dangers that inspired feelings of uncertainty and fear in even the bravest elves. As the crimson light faded around them, the horsemen anxiously scanned the ridges above the pass, expecting at any minute to be assailed by an orc warband or some deadlier denizen of the mountains, incensed by their intrusion into their territory. The crags were indeed home to some fearsome creatures, but none so relentless and dangerous as the black cad, sharp-eyed warriors who were watching the high elves passing at that moment. A groan from the end of the column of riders made the others twist round in their saddles. In shocked surprise, they saw the last elf in the line slumped over the neck of his startled steed, a crossbow bolt protruding from his back. The bolt had found its mark perfectly, having pierced the elf's heart. He was already dead. The dead elf's panicked horse bolted along the pass, disturbing the other animals. As the steed whinnied and shied, shouts came from some riders. Others span around, first one way, then the other, in a desperate and futile attempt to locate the sniper. But there was no further crossbow fire, or in fact any sign of the attackers. Apart from their dead companion, it was as if nothing had happened at all. "We should go after them," suggested one of the Silverhelms rather too boldly, "and ride them down." "In this half-light," retorted Alien, "we should easily find them if we split up." "No," barked the unit's commander. "We stay together." The young knight glowered back at Alien with a look of defiance, but kept his place in the line. "Now let us be on our way." The Dark Elf scout party watched the riders ride off, their keen eyesight not in any way inhibited by the lack of light. No, their time was just beginning. The guard shivered as much from a growing sense of unease as from the cold. It had been his dubious pleasure to be one of those selected to take the first watch. The troop had made it out of Stormfire Pass as the sun finally vanished beyond the jagged horizon. But they were still within the boundary of the mountains. It had been decided that to go on through the night consumed with tiredness after 2 days' hard riding and the mercy of keen-sighted potential enemies would be pure folly. No! This way the resting elves could be sure of being surrounded and protected by their fellows, who could give them warning of any potential threat in plenty of time. Still, however, even though they desperately needed sleep, many could not after the attack in the pass. What was that? The guard looked around quickly to his right, straining to see anything at all in the darkness. He was sure he had heard something not far from the camp. Looking to his far left and then to his right, he could see other guards staring out into the night. Neither had reacted to the sound, suggesting that they had not heard it. There it was again, only closer now. Cautiously, sword at the ready, the elf slowly stepped away from his post in direction of the sound. The black-cloaked figure let the body of the silver helm slip from his grasp and slump to the ground, his throat cut. Without saying a word, through a series of hand signals, the leader of the Dark Elf scouting party directed his warriors towards the crest of the ridge overlooking the camp. Even through the cold, dark towers of Naggaroth, the usual haunts of the foul Dark Elves were leagues away to the north, beyond the uncrossable Doomglades. Bands of their hawk-eyed scouts would regularly make guerrilla raids on the High Elf enclave of Arnhelm. Theirs was the tactics of sniping and ambush. It was said that they could harry their prey for days, slowly picking off their victims one by one. Unimpeded by the rugged terrain of the mountains, the Dark Elf scouts had followed the patrol for the last 2 days, using shortcuts familiar to them that actually ran through the tunnels and caves under the range of the Black Spines. The Dark Elves had known of a number of ways through these tunnels for centuries, although they did not venture into the deeper caves. For there dwelt indescribable eyeless things that shunned all light and warmth, that could tear apart rocks and Dark Elves with equal ease. However, a trained scout could travel through the safe tunnels and cut out several leagues of more awkward and hazardous paths above ground. The 6 Dark Elves were now crouched at the top of the encampment, repeating crossbows at the ready. With one silent signal from their leader, the scout party stealthily scurried down the slope and melted into the night. Alien was awoken by a cry. In seconds the troop was on its feet, some seeing to the horses which were whinnying nervously. Several of the elves who had been on guard were standing together just outside the edge of the camp. Alien quickly joined them. "It's Gandrel," said one of the guards. His throat's been cut." "Any sign of the attacker?" demanded Alien. "No, nothing." There was a shout from another of the elves nearby. "Over here! There's a set of footprints." Alien strode over to the young Silverhelm. The single set of prints of a pair of booted feet in the grey dust disappeared into the night towards the higher ground. The High Elf commander stood deep in thought for several moments, his brow lined in concentration. So far he only had evidence of one assailant, and if that could be dealt with swiftly, the danger would be over. Alien's supernaturally keen High Elf hearing heard a slight click from away in the darkness, followed by a loud shonk A look of horror spread across the face of the silver helm by Alien's side, and then he slumped forward. Even before the body of the first silver helm hit the ground, a crossbow bolt in his neck, another was clutching at a shaft sticking out of his midriff. As Alien roused himself, a shadow seemed to coalesce from the darkness around him into a humanoid form. Drawing his sword and leaping to one side in one fluid moment, Alien felt the bolt glance off his scaled armour and swept his blade around in one arc. There was a cry, and then the shadow was swallowed by the night once more. "Arm yourself! We are being attacked!" he yelled, suppressing his own feelings of panic. The body in the footprints had been a trap, and he had led his men straight into it. 2 more elves fell under the hail of arrows. He felt so helpless, fighting an unseen and unreachable enemy. He had no idea where the next attack would come from, so he made a snap decision. "To the horses!" he commanded. "Let us ride away from here." The dark elves revelled in the screams of the dying high elves, their hated king. Naggaroth was theirs. The lords of Ulthuan would never take it from them. With the first soft light of dawn, the sentry standing at the gates of Arnhelm looked out to the mountains to the west and caught sight of the lone grey horse galloping across the plain towards the enclave. When he saw a rider slumped across its neck, he immediately alerted his superior. The gates were open to admit the horse, and the guards immediately made to help the elf slouched, semi-conscious in the shadow, with a crossbow bolt stuck in his side. The rider was wheezing badly, suggesting that the bolt had punctured a lung. As he was helped down from his exhausted steed, Alien half opened his eyes. They ambushed us. We could not help ourselves." His words came raspingly, as he appeared to be almost delirious. "They charged down the rear guard." Tears began to run down his face. "They killed the horses." He coughed, and a trickle ran from the corner of his mouth. They killed us all." And then he was dead. An eerie stillness hung over the blasted plain between the 2 armies. Mounted on his scrawny war-horse, the general of the rebel slave army looked across the bleak wasteland at the dark elf force, and his heart fell. He knew that this was the day he would die. An oppressive atmosphere shrouded the rebel army. Hagen knew what it was, a tense feeling of anticipation and fear. Before them, the dark elf horde stretched out across the plain as far as any of them could see to the north and to the south. Hagen could hardly take in the number of dark elves ranged against his ill-matched army. Such was the size of the implacable force. The enemy's black armour gleamed dully in the hazy light of the watery sun, and here and there pinpricks of light glinted off sharply horned blades. The army of the oppressors stood ranged before the slaves like a mighty, immovable wall. Directly in front of them was the infantry, lithe and sinuous dark elf men and women, fighting side by side, armed with deadly repeating crossbows, all ready for battle and almost goading the slaves to attack them by their mocking expressions. Behind the crossbowmen were the spearmen, the tips of their weapons visible above the warriors. Along with their armoured bodies of the dark elves, the effect they had was to make the unit look like some enormous, spiny, carapaced, many-legged horror. Just the view of these regiments was enough to instill a knotted feeling of fear in the stomachs of the rebels. But there was worse still. Ranged between the units of the infantry were huge torsion-powered ballistas, loaded with heavy steel-tipped bolts. The notorious repeater bolt throwers, powerful weapons One bolt fired by such a machine could penetrate several ranks of troops easily, passing straight through a warrior's body. The bolt throwers could also fire volleys into the enemy ranks with equally devastating effect. Beyond the regiments of crossbowmen and spearmen to both the north and the south were serried ranks of dark elf warriors, all intently staring through the slave army behind them. Hagen could make out great lumbering, green-skinned reptiles being ridden by magnificently armoured champions. The creatures' heads swayed luminously back from side to side, nostrils flaring as they sniffed out the enemy, identifying them through their scent, a combination of sweat and fear. The Dark Elf Knights, mounted upon these cold-blooded monsters, stared directly ahead of them at the pitiful ranks of the rebel slaves, their chillingly handsome angular features made even more dreadful by the fixed expressions of cruel determination and ruthless dedication. Nothing would stop them once they had chosen their victims. A distant screeching cry echoed through the stillness, and Hagen spun around, his heart pounding. Circling high above the battlefield were a number of bird-like silhouettes. From their terrible screams, Hagen knew that they were harpies, ready to pick off the wounded and the dying. Hagen's steel snorted impassively, pawing at the ground. Despite its emancipated condition, the war horse had a fiery temperament and was eager to feel the bones of the enemy breaking under its hooves. Hagen suddenly became aware of another raucous howling, joining through the mist. The noise was coming from the ranks of the Dark Elves, and could mean only one thing. The Witch Elves were preparing for battle. Hagen could see the blood-lusting warrior women emerging from between the regular troops, bearing no shields, but carrying long, venom-edged knives. The Witch Elves were beginning to foam at the mouth, drugged into a frenzy by the hallucinogenic, herb-laced blood which they had all imbibed before battle. The warrior sisterhood of the Lord of Murder were rightly feared as the wildest and most bloodthirsty of the Dark Elves. As the Witch Elves screamed and howled, the rest of the Dark Elf horde began chanting to Cain. The slaves all knew that there was no hope for them now. This was the end. Not one of them would leave the battlefield alive, but even then they knew that it was futile. They had to try. They had come too far to give up now. If they were going to die, Hagen thought, there was to be no better way than to die fighting, and to take as many of their evil oppressors with them as possible. At least that way it would be less likely they would end up as tortured and degraded living sacrifices to the accursed Dark Elf god. And nothing could be worse than that. "We may be malnourished and ill-prepared, and certainly no match for the forces of the Witch King," Hagen thought. "But we have right on our side, and the knowledge that we have nothing left to lose." With a grim expression of resigned resolution on his face, Hagen hefted his weapon and prepared to end his days fighting. Dark Lord Rural of Hageneth looked over the heads of his forces at the pitiful slave army that faced him, and allowed himself a cruel smile of satisfaction. 10 days before, he had received the intelligence from his scouts concerning the whereabouts of the slave army hiding in the Black Spire Mountains. The Dark Elves had long known about the clandestine contingent of slaves. Over the years, slaves from Naggaroth's great plantations had at times evaded the watchful gazes of their overseers and escaped into the unforgiving wilderness. This concerned the Dark Elves little, as the land of Chill was harsh enough to live anyway. But out in the open at the mercy of the elements, not to mention the marauding tribes of orcs and their goblin king, it was unlikely that any escaped slave could survive for long. But in more recent times, rumours had reached the great cities of the Dark Elves that a large number of renegade slaves were hiding in the Black Spire Mountains, and that they had a leader. 10 days had been ample time to mobilise Harganeth's army. Every single Dark Elf that could be called upon to fight if necessary, and many welcomed the opportunity to do so. Being able to leave the claustrophobic confines of the city for a time and indulge in one of the greatest pleasures, that of killing. Lord Ruel knew that the slaves were no threat to his force, and he was happy to treat the battle as a training exercise for his army. The warriors of Naggaroth had always been ready in case the Witch King sent forth the long-awaited command that the Black Arks would sail once more to reclaim the island, continent of Ulthuron. Ruel smiled in pleasant anticipation of the coming slaughter. Bravely, Hagen's troops readied themselves to face the Dark Elf onslaught. A shower of black-fletched bolts darkened the heavy grey sky, rained down into the massed slaves. Many fell around Hagen, the slaves' only protection being scraps of stolen armour, which proved too scant to be very effective against the crossbowmen's weapons. Hagen yelled out over the screams of the Dark Elves and the moans of the dying for his warriors to put all feelings of fear from their hearts. Theirs was the side of right, and they would have nothing left to lose. Hearing their leader's words, the rebels, filled with the courage of doomed men, took the initiative and surged forward to meet their foe. With a dreadful whistling sound, the first volley of steel-tipped darts from the repeater bolt-throwers flew into the front ranks of the slaves. Many of the deadly missiles did not stop at the front line, but continued through the men's bodies into the unfortunate troops behind them. Undaunted, and with the momentum of their charge carrying past their fallen comrades, the slaves ran forward, even now more driven, determined to avenge the deaths of their friends. The infantry from the two sides clashed in the centre of the plain with a mighty ringing of steel upon steel. Headless human bodies fell to the left and right, while the now enraged slaves cut down equal numbers of Dark Elf warriors, giving their bloodthirsty battle cries. The Cold One Knights urged their cold-blooded steeds forward into the flanks of the slave regiments. Usually slow and sluggish in their movements, as soon as the Cold Ones had tasted the blood of the humans falling before them, bellowing loudly, the great beasts no longer needed any encouragement from their riders. Their monstrous steeds striding into the melee, the knights transfixed their enemies on their lances. At the same time, the frenzied Witch Elves cut a bloody swath into the very side of the rebel army. Yelling insanely, the intoxicated murderesses dealt out death to all those around them, fighting with evil glee with each drop of blood they spilt, bringing glory of Cain. With a whining roar, a bolt of black fire burst from the Dark Elf ranks and smashed into a unit of slaves, scattering their charred bodies in an explosion of dark magic. Caught between the contingent of Cold One Knights, their reptilian mounts, and the frenzied Witch Elves, a regiment of slave warriors turned in panic and fled from its attackers, loping after the fleeing slaves. The Cold Ones easily caught up with them, and the knights drove them into the ground, while the great beasts tore the wretches limb from limb with their mighty jaws. However, as the dark, dread knights cut down their companions, some of the slaves still managed to make good their flight, avoiding the lances of the Dark Elf champions. With siren screams, the black-winged harpies swooped down out of the sky, survivors from the ground in their flesh-rending talons, screeching in the wild ecstasy of bloodlust. The harpies rose into the air, tearing apart the bodies of the humans, and the screams of the slaves mingling with those of the demented monsters. The embittered slave general stared out in dismay at the carnage taking place before him. In a momentary break in the fighting close to him, Hagen saw the slave standard fall as a Witch Elf sliced the bearer's head from his shoulders. A second volley launched from the bolt-throwers and hurtled through the quickly falling rebels' lines. The remaining slaves fought on desperately, another congealed missile of dark power slamming into the magically defenceless slaves to devastating effect. Hagen knew that they could not take much more of this. Maybe he should order a retreat. There was no way the slaves could defeat the Dark Elves with their great numbers and military precision. But then again, there was nowhere for them to go. The Black Spine Mountains held no hope for them. There was no way they could escape the accursed continent, and now that the Dark Elves knew of their existence, it would only be a matter of time before their one-time captors followed them into the mountains and readily finished them off. Resignedly realizing that there was absolutely no hope for the slaves, Hagen urged his steed into the fray. He was only dimly aware of what happened next. The first thing he was conscious of was the assassin's dagger forced up to his hilt between his ribs, and then the pain hit him. As the poison took excruciating effect, the slave general felt his horse fall beneath him as it was struck from the side by a charging cold one, and its rider's lance. Hagen's eyes briefly met the cold-hearted stare of the knight before he toppled to the ground under the crumbling hooves and razor-edged claws. As he succumbed to the fumes of the poisonous slime of the beast's skin, Hagen felt the fetid breath of the reptilian monster on his face and gagged. The last thing he saw was the gaping fang-lined maw as it closed around his skull. The battle was over. It had been won swiftly and decisively by Lord Rule's mighty force, and Dark Elf casualties had been minimal. The slaves' battle standard now lay trampled and torn on the rocky plain, as did their general. Virtually all the slaves had been killed or mortally wounded, and those left were now being herded up. The wretched humans probably thought that they would now be returned to the plantations, but Lord Rule had decided that they could not be trusted, and he would have to make an example of them. They would all be executed in a manner that was suitably slow and agonizing. Rule looked across the wasteland, now stained red with blood, and heaped with the bodies of the slaves. And here and there, muddled corpses of Dark Elves, and the occasional cold one. The Witch Elves were already excitedly smearing themselves in the still warm blood of the fallen, renewing their pact to their master, Cain. The warriors of the Witch King had been victorious. Of course, Rule thought to himself, yes, the suppression of the slave revolt had been a most entertaining spectacle. Bring it to my bedchamber directly, and be quick about it. Lord Corvus snapped, clouting the servant across the back of the head. Unbegrudgingly the mute shambled away towards the cellars. Taken as a child only 4 years ago by a Dark Elf raiding fleet, the poor wretch's master had first had his tongue cut out, and then lamed him in one leg. Sensible precautions, Corvus thought, so that the human could never betray him or easily leave his service, not unless the Dark Lord deemed it, in which case it would be with the assistance of a dagger in his throat. There was nothing Corvus liked more than a glass of the finest Carcron wine upon retiring, and after today's events at court, he felt even more readily for it. He was in a foul mood, even worse than normal. He had needed a nightcap to settle his nerves and put aside his anxieties. Corvus turned and strode away towards his personal quarters. From his hiding place, Shadowblade eyed the 2 well-armed, heavily armoured elite guards standing outside Corvus's bedchamber. The antechamber was well lit, and he knew he would be spotted should he enter. Although an accomplished swordsman, Shadowblade preferred to kill with subtlety and, if possible, avoid direct confrontation. As a master of disguise, he would have no trouble impersonating one of the guards, but to do so he would have to eliminate the other. Also, if he could help it, Shadowblade did not want Corvus's death to be discovered until well after he had left the scene of the crime. No, he would try something else here. The guards stood to attention as their lord entered the antechamber. Corvus walked heartily past them and opened the double doors. He suddenly paused on the threshold and turned to one of the armoured dark elves. "You may leave me now," he said dismissively. "Are you sure, sire?" the guard inquired, mystified by the Dark Lord's command. "Of course I'm sure, oaf," Corvus retorted. "I just gave the order, didn't I?" "Yes, sire. At once, sire." Without another word, the two guards left their post and disappeared down the corridor. The limping mute froze in horror. In front of him, the silent passageway, a pool of blood was congregating on the cool, cold marble floor as it dripped from the shadows above. Nervously, the servant looked up at the vaulted ceiling. Slumped over a crossbeam like a puppet, with its strings cut, was the body of a dark elf guard. The mute fled back towards his master's chambers as quickly as he could. He had to warn Lord Corvus. Corvus stopped in the antechamber. Where were the guards? How dare the impudent fools leave their posts? He would have them both handed over to the Witch Elves, but he would have to wait until morning. Now he needed to sleep. Corvus entered the bedchamber, and in the almost total darkness, he made his way over to the bed. Instantly, a black shape flew at him, pushing him onto the bed. Corvus found himself being held down by the assassin, who had one hand over the Dark Lord's mouth. The Lord stared with frightened eyes into those of Shadowblade, the murderer supreme. "You thought you could insult the Hag Queen of the Witch Elves and live," the master assassin hissed. Corvus struggled to free himself, but then froze suddenly as the poison-tipped blade lodged into his heart. His body was immediately racked with the most terrible pain, as if the white, hot knives had been forced into every nerve ending. "Now look upon the face of death," Shadowblade growled, and taking his hand from Corvus's mouth, removed his mask from his face. "You!" Corvus grasped incredulously with his dying breath, and then was still. A satisfied smile formed on Shadowblade's lips. Another mission successfully completed, but now it was time to leave. Puffing and panting, the servant turned the corner into the passageway and found himself looking into the face of the master assassin. In the last few seconds of his life, the mute was confused as to what exactly happened. Shadowblade swept past him, his flapping cloak making him look like some great bird of ill omen, and it was only the servant looked after the fleeting assassin that he realized he had been stabbed. In less than a minute, the lame mute had died a swift but agonizing death as the black venom took its course. Shadowblade paused for a moment to savour the death of the helpless wretch. The mute would have been no threat to the master assassin, being unable to protect himself against the trained killer or tell anyone what he really looked like. But it was the principle that mattered. Grimly, Shadowblade replaced his mask. No one saw his face and lived. No one. And then he was gone into the night.